Jaron Lanier's book, You Are Not a Gadget, a Manifesto, is, in my estimation, the most important book on culture published this year. Writing from inside the very center of the digital revolution, he's asking profound questions about the goals and values of the internet, the intelligence we impute to computers, and the emergent theology of the digital age, which Jaron calls cybernetic totalism. The Jewish elements in his work are implicit, but in my view, somewhat substantial. One can imagine his work, in part, perhaps, as an updating of the theology of Martin Buber, who famously divided the world into I-thou relationships, in which individuals truly relate to one another, and I-it relationships, in which individuals relate to others as objects and are objectified in return. In the late 1980s, Jaron Lanier led the team that developed the first implementations of multi-person virtual worlds, as well as the first avatars within such systems. He has served as a visiting scientist at Silicon Graphics, and he was scholar-in-large for Microsoft from 2006 to 2009, and serves as partner architect there. He is also on the 2010 Time Magazine Top 100, a list of the world's most influential thinkers, leaders, and artists. I noticed with some humor that he is on the same list as Lady Gaga, but in a different category. Jaron Lanier is also a pianist, composer, and collector of unusual musical instruments, maintaining one of the largest and most varied collections of actively played rare instruments in the world. Our Link program, of which tonight is the concluding lecture for the spring series, includes talks by prominent thinkers as well as a fellowship for Jewish educators. The program as a whole is underwritten by the Covenant Foundation. Tonight's program is supported by the Wallace Foundation, which seeks to support and share effective ideas and practices that will strengthen education leadership, arts participation, and out-of-school learning. I wanted to thank the Wallace Foundation for their support tonight and welcome their leadership and members here. This talk with Jaron Lanier will be available online on Monday. If you are moved to tweet tonight, please use the hashtag link. Without further ado, please welcome Jaron Lanier.
So, what is it? It's called CAN. It's from Laos. There's a pretty good case to be made that this is the original prototype of the computer. Now, here's how the story goes. Many thousands of years ago, things like this, well, many, 3, 4, 5,000 years ago, things like this were traded across the Silk Route from Asia and were known to the ancient Greeks. The Romans, being the Romans, felt they had to make the sort of mega version, so they made a giant steam-powered thing that made noise in the Colosseum while people were being killed and stuff. Sort of like being the house band for worldwide wrestling, I guess, in the ancient world. And the thing was so big that people couldn't operate it, so they had these levers that they would use, and that turned into the keyboard. The whole thing evolved into the pipe organ, but because there were these huge levers, from the very earliest days, they could be played through an automation mechanism, a very crude one, and from the very earliest history of the pipe organ, there were player pipe organs as a result of that legacy, because of how big the hydraulis was. The player pipe organ evolved into the player piano. There were player piano instruments almost as early as real pianos. You're tweeting. It makes you only half here. I'm sorry to bug you about it, but I do. Someday you'll think back on these days like, what was I thinking? There was an early improvising player piano, a piano that actually could choose its chords randomly. That thing inspired a guy named Jacquard to make a programmable loom, and that thing served as the prototype for the general purpose calculator via Babbage. Ta-da! So, first digital computer. This is the first object with multiple parallel similar parts that are turned off or on that I know of in human culture. So this is the first digital memory. And, even better, we don't quite know how it works. There's a weird balance that allows the notes to go on or off, and it's not fully understood. It's sort of understood. And I once had a wonderful afternoon taking one of these apart with Richard Feynman, the great physicist, trying to really nail down the mechanism, and it still eludes us in its details. You cannot Google to find out how this works. Okay, so this is fun for me because it's the first time I've done something in a Jewish context since my bar mitzvah, I think. Most people don't realize I'm Jewish. I think maybe I don't look or sound Jewish. I am very Jewish. I'm a child of a Holocaust survivor. And that was on my mother's side. On my father's side, the family was almost utterly destroyed in the pogroms, barely survived. One of the folks in my father's family was mute for life because she'd survived as her sister was killed by a sword under a bed by keeping completely silent, and she never made another peep in her whole life. So I feel about as Jewish as you can be. Up until not too many years ago, if I looked up myself on the internet on one of the search engines, the only people who listed me as Jewish were the anti-Semites who would have these sites about like, oh, look at all these prominent Jews. And I noticed that exactly that list made it onto the first list of prominent Jewish computer scientists on Wikipedia. And so now the secret's out. I think I'm going to talk about Jewish stuff a bit. I'll also talk about the book, but I'll just try to say a couple things. One thing is I've always thought that the sense of optimism that is the foundation of the Enlightenment and of the whole project of technology has a Jewish origin, more or less. I don't think I'm the first person to say this, but if you look at the great old cultures of mankind and the sort of worldview, the metaphysics that they have, some of the cultures have this sort of cyclic sensibility. Hindu and Buddhist cultures tend to think of time as being a great cycle, and what there is will be again, what there is was. There's another sort of a thing, which is this ramp to a specific destination, which is then the end of time, Ragmarol or the apocalypse or something. But in the Jewish idea was always like, this Messiah will come and things will get better. There was this notion of something still within this world at some time that's absolutely not revealed, that you can look forward to, that the future is better than the past, but in a very temporal way, in a concrete way. And I think that that's unique. And the combination of that with the diaspora, the combination of that with these people who are kind of hanging on to each other through texts and networks spread out across the world over centuries and centuries. Amazing combination. And I see a little bit of that quality in I think it made it into the Enlightenment a little bit via figures. God, my brain. You know the guy who we excommunicated and treated terribly? Spinoza, of course, who I really love. I love Spinoza's writing. So I've always felt very Jewish in my work as a technologist. I'll tell you one little story briefly about my work as a musician and being Jewish, and then I'll talk about the book a little bit. I just finished, I write symphony music, I write for orchestras, and I just finished a big piece with a full chorus, which I've never done before, and I'm terrified. It's really hard. But it's going to premiere in October in Orlando at the Bach Festival there. And The text is by Amelia Laniet. How many people have heard of Amelia? So this is like astounding to me. There are all these things called women's studies programs, and nobody knows about her. So Amelia was the first published female poet in the English language, and is one of the few friends of Shakespeare that we know about. She lived across the courtyard from William Shakespeare and published these sonnets and these essays and these diatribes, and she's also known as the first feminist in English. And her writing is really kind of extraordinary. There's cases where she makes fun of some of Shakespeare's stuff, and there's turns of phrase that show up in her stuff before Shakespeare. So this is an amazing figure. Now, does this have anything to do with being Jewish? Well, you might have noticed that my name doesn't sound very Jewish, right, Laniet? It's a name my dad chose in part because of fear of anti-Semitism. It's an Ellis Island name. He just felt like, we're going to sound gringo, and we're going to go off to the farthest place on the road where they still have a college. That's how I ended up in southern New Mexico as a kid, and just like get away from all this crap in Europe, and just go as far as possible. So he chose Laniet in honor of a guy named Sidney Laniet. Sidney Laniet is a fairly well-known 19th century figure. He founded a lot of the American orchestras, and he was probably the best flute player of the century, but mostly he's known as a poet. And he also was a philosopher. He wrote a book on poetry and music and this sort of synesthetic idea from the 19th century perspective. Also one of the first people to write about industrialization thoughtfully, I think. Sidney Laniet is a direct descendant of Amelia, as are tons and tons of musicians and poets. I have a good friend named Quincy Jones, who's very well known as a music producer, musician, amazing guy. Bit of a nutcase, but just wonderful and sweet. And whenever I see him, he says, "Hey, cousin Laniet." Now, the reason he says that is that one of Amelia's descendants ended up in Barbados, and Quincy's mom was a Laniet. And so now I always say, "Oh, Quincy, you know, I'm a virtual Laniet. I'm not a real one." But the story has more twists than you might expect. It turns out Amelia was Jewish. What happened was she was part of a family based in Morocco that made their living as itinerant musicians. They got a gig in Venice, moved to the Venetian ghetto, and we actually have a portrait of her that survives and also a woodcut of the family business. And when you look at these things, it's really kind of weird because she has this hair that's totally frizzed and virtually coming into dreadlocks. It's like right on the edge. And these for me have no significance or meaning except there'd be too much damn work to avoid them. And there's a certain stream. I met some kids at a train station in Vienna where my mom was from who had dreadlocks, and they turned out to be Jewish, which is, there aren't that many Jewish kids around there. And there's like some strain of Jews with hair like this, you know. And so it turns out her family moved to the Venetian ghetto looking for work. They have this woodcut of their family, their calling card basically looks just like my studio with all these instruments flying everywhere and this huge mess. It's just amazing. They got a gig in London, court musicians for the royal family. They had to hide their Jewishness to do it, took on a new name. Amelia gets pregnant at 17. To avoid scandal, she's married off to a French guy that she never met, named Laniet. Thus the name. So basically, it is a Jewish name. It's really strange. And you know, so Quincy said, "Does this make me Jewish?" I said, "Oh, yeah, you know, I think you're there, yeah." So, yeah, so I won't suggest that he does what there's the jazz saxophonist Ornette Coleman. In midlife, he became very interested in Kabbalah and decided to have a circumcision. And it's like, oh, you're kidding, but he did it. Yeah, so I don't think Quincy's going to do that. But this is like what not to do with the news that you're actually Jewish in middle age. Anyway, so these are some of the tales. We should talk about my book. The book is an attempt to find a way to be a humanist and pro-technology at the same time. And it's hard because the overwhelmingly dominant culture of technology in the last decade especially has been, at least to my sensibility, anti-human. There's been an assault on the idea that an individual perspective really matters, that somebody taking the time to introspect really matters, that there's something mysterious, if not a soul, then a center of consciousness, something that we don't quite understand that just might be there at the center of a person, that a person might be something different than a computer. These are things that I believe are true. I don't know for certain, of course. There are limits to how much we can really know. But there's a cost to believing in the sort of nerd view of reality that's become so mainstream. The cost is that we can expect less of ourselves and gradually turn into pseudo-people. And that's what I'm concerned is happening. I'm concerned that a lot of the media designs that have become popular, at least from my perspective as this sort of aged, I'm like this old guy. I turned 50, so that makes me like this an antique, you know. I actually, when I turned 40, I was at Stanford, an undergraduate said, Yaron Laniet, you're still alive? So now I'm 50, which makes me like some sort of holdover from some wormhole in another universe, I guess. But at any rate, from my perspective, these ideas that I abhor are they've been around since the origin of computing. And in the book I describe the precise origin of them, which is Alan Turing just before his death. But the dominance of these ideas is incredibly recent, and there's no reason to believe that it can't be reversed. There's no reason to believe that we couldn't have a humanistic computing culture. Now, to add insult to injury, or I guess injury to insult, the particular designs that devalue people don't just do so symbolically, they also make people poor. And I'm personally convinced that a lot of the economic trouble and the general decline in outlook around the world has a lot to do with humanity's decision to regiment itself according to computer network designs instead of according to reality and human designs. You have, and this becomes more of an argument, some of which is in the book and some of which is in stuff that I'm in the process of writing now. But from an American perspective, which is different from the European or the Chinese or the Indian, which although they all connect, but from an American perspective, what essentially happened was in the 80s and 90s, we had a national conversation in which we decided, screw manufacturing, screw making real stuff. We'll be intellectual property people. We'll make the movies, we'll make the software, we'll be the glamorous ones, we'll be the intellectual people who get paid for intellectual property. And we more or less did that. We seeded the display industry and many others rather knowingly and consciously as part of a decision to pursue this life of the mind that we'd be paid for. And then the internet comes along, and internet culture says, wait a second, you shouldn't be paid for the life of the mind. That's the stuff you should give up so we can advertise at you. You're just fodder for our advertising business. You're not going to benefit from that. Forget it. You can pretend you will. You can pretend you'll make a music career by putting up YouTube videos, but you really won't. And even in the back of the mind, you know it. So we essentially shot ourselves in both feet, leaving ourselves without a paradigm for making a living. Now, I'm exaggerating tremendously because there are many exceptions and the world is complex. But in the big picture, that's approximately what's happened in America's national story. That we've rejected both plausible stories for how we could be responsible for our own keep. And you know, we can't just sit here whining. We have to actually figure out something, some means to. So we don't want the government to take care of us because we're really libertarian, but on the other hand, we give everything away because we're really cyber-libertarian, and on the other hand, we don't really make any stuff because that's filthy and dirty, and who wants to do it? So, new? You know, so we haven't gotten past new yet. And so you have a sort of a spiritual problem that's echoed in a material problem that has almost the same structure. And that is what I view as a core of our malady at the moment. If you look at the structure of investment in the world, it's to a remarkable degree a shadow or a mirror of the structure of the internet and the way that people have ceded their own careers to this advertising business. Let me describe to you what I mean, and then I'll stop and I'll take questions. So now I'm proceeding into some stuff that isn't in the book, that's in my next writing. The Silicon Valley, with the exception of Apple, which is a whole other story, which I'm not happy about either, Silicon Valley is running on this idea of what we call advertising. It's not really advertising, because every time a company like Google or Facebook tries to put up a real ad that has a message, they don't make money with that. What it really is selling links. It's connection fees. It's like a dating service or something. It's just connecting people together. And so you charge for it if there's commercial value. And then if there isn't, of course, then you don't charge for it. Now, what happened, so the way things work in computers is that digital software and digital designs intrinsically have these qualities that lead to extraordinary lock-in effects, meaning that when somebody's using it, they have a hard time doing something different. It used to be that this happened around layers of software or file formats, but with the internet, it happens because of the difficulty of coordinating everybody to move from one server to another one. So, for instance, if you wanted to start a competitor to eBay, it'd be really, really hard, because everybody's already on eBay. So at any given moment, if somebody wants to buy or sell something, they're better off being there than hoping for people to show up at some new site. And it's just so hard to coordinate a mass migration that it happens very rarely. So that's what we call a network effect lock-in. They're very, very powerful. The lock-in that Google has is a really unusual one, and I finally realized how it worked the other day. And when I've been telling my friends at Google about it, they suddenly go, "Oh my God, you're right. That's how we make money." And it's a strange little thing, but how it works is, let's say you're buying a keyword on Google, and somebody else wins the auction. Well, normally in the physical world, if you lose an auction or for some reason you can't buy something, you just go and do something else with your money. But the thing about the Google world is that the stuff being sold is made up by the customers, because it's some keyword, it's some piece of the language, and the language is infinitely extensible. So what you do is instead when you're punched down vertically and you lose something, you instead move horizontally and create a new thing that you can defend, a new keyword. And so the thing spreads out like a film horizontally and generates, tens of billions of dollars. Now, the interesting thing about it is that anybody who's putting any money into this kind of has to stay there, because the moment they let go of a piece, the next best competitor in the world for whom it's relevant will be right there, because everything is subject to this auction structure. So everybody's kind of locked into this huge thing. Now, the reason I'm describing that, so the interesting thing is that the lock-in on the eBay lock-in is based on benefit, and the Google lock-in is based on risk. It's a really interesting inversion. So I won't go over that in too much detail right now, but what's interesting is that if you look at how investment works over the internet with massive hedge funds and these huge leveraging schemes that move capital around internationally, they have exactly the same structure. And instead of making up new natural language keywords, you make up new transactions. So the actual number of things to invest in is a small, finite list, but you can always make up new transactions and spread this huge film that can grow to an arbitrary size. So they're precise, it's the same structure. And so I had this realization, and it's the natural way to get the toughest lock using networks. And this is the power. So what's happening is basically the game of human power, the game of politics, and the game of managing influence has turned into this computer architecture thing. And computer architecture tends to be all on, all off, so it tends to have incredible concentrating effects. And this, to me, is a core of why our economies have become incompetent. That what we've done to ourselves with social networking is exactly what we're doing to ourselves with capital. And so we have a huge problem. And my own sense is that there are going to be a lot of angry people in the next 10 or 20 years who grew up in a world that is less functional than it ought to be, given our technological capabilities. And I hope they have the right target to be angry at. I'm a little worried about, when people get angry, they're very easy to misdirect. The very, very easiest number one trick in any politician's book is misdirect angry people. So that's the old game before the servers came up. So I'm very interested in seeing how this turns out, and I'm a little concerned about it. So I hope that doesn't sound too dark. I'll just say a positive thing, and then I'll take questions. The positive thing I want to say is that there was this thing that was happening with high school kids and undergraduates for like 15 years, where every class that came in was sort of nerdier and less questioning than the previous one, sort of more conformist from my point of view, to the point where about like last year, people were so incredibly conformist on the social networking diet and on a certain way of doing things that it was almost as if they were just following a script in their lives. I found it disturbing. I found sort of less individuality and less, speaking in the broad, of course with exceptions, but there was this extraordinary degree of sameness. Suddenly this year I'm seeing it turn around. I'm seeing a lot of kids who are thinking for themselves, a lot of kids who don't view the designs as being a badge of their generation, but rather something that's been imposed on them by the previous one. And I'm suddenly starting to feel really optimistic, and I'm really liking these kids. So I'll end with that and take questions.
If we could ask you speaking to the mic would be great, so everyone can hear, and we can also tape it. And also, if you have any surveys, if you could just pass them all the way to this end so we won't lose them for our raffle.
Hi. I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about when you're sort of talking about the commodification of there's a sort of a finite list of things and we're getting this horizontal spread. And I was just curious if you could talk a little bit about a lot of privacy issues and how people don't really understand their identity and the value behind that and how it sort of fits into that commodity scheme.
Yeah. Well, the usual focal question on Facebook lately is privacy, which I think is a little bit of a misstatement. Let me say a couple things about it. First of all, if the seeding of privacy was genuinely symmetrical, it wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. I think it's entirely imaginable to live in a world in which there are fewer secrets in general. And for a little while, the internet was looking like it might turn into that world. So if it's true that in exchange for exposing one's life, everyone else does it, but also all the institutions, all the powerful people, if it's really symmetrical, that could work. I mean, the truth is that almost all secrets are dull. You know, I mean, all you have to do is look at political scandals and you fall asleep. I mean, the rarity is if one of them actually seeing a woman instead of a man these days. But that, you know, absent that novelty, basically, it's just so dreary and predictable. And that's so most secrets are not that interesting. The thing is that there's a radical asymmetry here. So what happens is, like, let's say you have a very pro-Facebook kid who's like, you know, this is my generation, it's sharing, you know, whatever. So the problem is, of course, that the social graph and other data structures representing them, which live inside the dark heart of the Facebook servers, are not shared. It's not symmetrical at all. But they versus their friends, the symmetry is maintained. So from their point of view, they're acting rationally. So then the question is, well, could anything bad happen because of this radical asymmetry? And the answer is yeah. I mean, the weird thing about Facebook is that no matter how hard it tries, it can't make much money. I mean, it's like maybe going to hit $1 billion this year in revenue and probably not any profit, or maybe a smidgen or something. And that's like embarrassing. It's 6 years. I mean, come on. Google got there 3 years after introducing their ad model, and it's like, I mean, like for the user growth that Facebook has, the revenue growth is pathetic, you know, and that's like, why? Well, part of it is Google's lock, which I described before. But also, I mean, the truth, basically nobody's found out how to exploit this stuff yet. And that's what makes it so scary. Like, what's it going to take to actually make something of this? And since the obvious things aren't working, like, somebody's going to have to come up with something. It's not, you know, they're investors there. They're going to have to do something. What'll it be? That's scary. If they were... Well, you know, many people have... Did everybody hear the question okay? He's asking, like, why can't it just stay a billion-dollar company? Why does it have to grow? It has investors. I mean, you probably know another Jewish weirdo in town named Craig Newmark who had a thought like that. It's like, you know, these internet services, you can grab one of these persistent lock-in niches and you don't really have to make all that much money. So you have this... So Craigslist is this giant site, and there are many things to be said about it that, you know, there are many complaints one can have, and I'm not praising everything about it, and it's been a disaster for newspapers and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, he said that more or less. I think, you know, It doesn't have to be giant. It can be perfectly good business. Why does it have to be this big thing? The problem with Facebook is it already has investors, so it's obliged. You know, that's the way our world works. So maybe what will happen to Facebook is it'll be nationalized or turned into God knows what. Maybe there'll be some weird fate. But what's going to happen well before that, there's going to be this long parade of people who are saying, we got to do something with this data. And that does scare me. I just, if it knew what it was going to do when it grew up already, then it would be a known quantity. Google is more or less a known quantity. Facebook isn't. Facebook doesn't know what it's going to do when it grows up. And that makes it kind of scary. Plus, the people are just, they have like this incredible talent for rubbing everybody the wrong way. And I'm a little concerned that they're getting too comfortable with being disliked so that they won't be socially persuadable anymore. They're not bad people, but I'm concerned about that effect. Yeah.
Speaking of music, as a musician, how do you see music and art having an impact, or the possibility for it having an impact on this anti-humanist network lock-in? How can the arts be a little disruptive of all of this?
It's mostly going the other direction right now. The internet, one of the reasons I really turned on, so I helped make up the open ideology. I mean, I made up a lot of this crap. I really did. I mean, like, a lot of the lines people spew about how, the newspapers and the record companies, they should have seen it coming, they were stupid. I actually came up with some of that rhetoric a long time ago. I was like, but what made me realize it wasn't working was seeing all my musicians be disempowered, basically. Like, there's all this endless rhetoric. You're so empowered, you can get all these views on YouTube or whatever. And meanwhile, people are losing their livelihoods and suffering. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, if you look at this, you can look at hard data for how many people used to actually survive as middle-class musicians, and it's just floored. And then there's this illusion that, there's all these people making this living from giving away stuff and then getting stuff out of it. I have tried to track down those people. I have a story about it in the book. And more recently, there are a few tech journalists that do it. There are a few special cases where it happens, but they're vanishingly small. They're just handfuls. And in the case of musician, I actually can't find one. I mean, every single case that I've really pursued seriously turns out to be a trust fund baby or something like that. Or if it, like to actually find these people, it's like this imaginary population. It's really kind of extraordinary. So now what about the other direction? What can the arts do to help? Well, I think there's a lot to be done there. One thing to say is that the overlap between sort of mathy, brainy kids and musicians is very, very strong. And music is one bridge between culture and tech that might be stronger than almost any other. Film and cinema is another one that's kind of there, and some writing, but music is probably the strongest one. And exactly what to do with that, I'm not sure. I mean, it's really hard. I have these ideas myself that if you make the experience of using computers more somatic and more sensitive, and it'll actually change the way people think about them, and it'll change the way things work. I might be wrong about that, but we're going to have a big test of that because there's some designs coming out in a big way that have that quality, and we'll see what cultural resonances happen with them. I don't know. It's a tough one. It's really, it's actually, and also what people think music is really under assault. There's so many people who think that music is just this combinatorial pattern thing, like the rock band, like hit the buttons right, and that, I have mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, I kind of like to see them doing that, but on the other hand, I feel like you're so missing the point, and not that there weren't generations of bad music teachers that committed exactly the same sin. But at least then you had like this nasty person to blame. In this case, that negative figure isn't there, so it's a little harder to see the problem.
I think as a follow-up to that, I know there's at least a couple people in the room that are technologists by vocation and musicians by avocation. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, as you as an individual, how do you rectify Yaron the musician to Yaron the technologist, and where do you see sort of the combinations, and how do you live both lives?
Well, in a chaotic, indescribable, semi-functional manner. The usual answer I give is true, which is that I practice cross-procrastination, where I try to create I'm always using one to delay the other so that I can feel like a lazy person getting away with something until there's some huge crisis, and then somehow it all comes together. And that's kind of my modus operandi. And it's immature and pathetic, but there you are. So if I only did one thing, I would starve in an alley somewhere. But by going back and forth, enough gets done that it sort of happens. And I have pretty much separate lives. Like in the movie, I do soundtracks, and in the movie database, my name was misspelled a long time ago, and I just kind of left it alone. And I just have this other persona in that world. And it's like it's weird how variegated the world is these days. I just did a show in Oakland in like a 3,000 seat house that was sort of like it was Yoko Ono's band. I'm part of the new Yoko Ono Plastic Ono band, and we did. And I was thinking, well, it's Oakland. There's got to be a bunch of people who'd know me from tech stuff, but I don't. Almost nobody noticed. It's like I'm just like this weird guy doing stuff with Yoko, and I don't know. It seems to work. That's all I can say.
So what do you think about the argument or the idea that with all these social networks and all these new relationships forming, that they're actually seeding the way for future collaboration that we haven't even yet seen? I hear what you're saying, and I go back and forth with being concerned and being extremely excited about the potential. But Howard Rheingold was talking to me about this kind of seeding the way for collaboration. It's adding all this like connective tissue.
I'm a total believer in collaboration and the importance of the internet to it. See, the thing is, I'm still a true believer. I'm totally into that stuff. It's just, like, to me, the stuff that I'm dumping on is the stuff of the last 10 years. I just think it's this huge wrong turn. I think this idea of this really simplistic, just slice people up and have people, like, enter database representations of themselves on Facebook and tweak a little bit of a sentence on Wikipedia, and, like, that's supposed to be the real deal. That, to me, is completely missing the point. I want those people to be fully there and to push themselves more than they ever expected, and to learn and grow and take risks and go through real experiences. And if you go back before this last 10 years, the rhetoric around the internet really had a different character. Martin Buber was mentioned in the intro, which is great. Now, one of my grandfathers was a close friend of Martin Buber's, a rabbi, and I've always loved Buber's stuff. If you go back to the 70s, I Thou was like required reading in the movement, the early internet, and people were talking. Stuart Brand used to be hawking I Thou, and the whole thing has gotten turned around into this nerdy thing where people are just little information cogs in this giant quest for the singularity or some kind of nonsense like that. There's been this real shift in emphasis. I'm actually a true believer and an optimist about the overall project.
I know. Don't you think that? I'm with you. The overall. I guess I hear what you're saying, but I believe optimistically that the good of it and the collaborative nature of it and what it's doing will ultimately win.
Yeah. Well, no, there's different kinds of collaboration this is in my book somewhere early on. It says you have to be somebody before you can share yourself. And that to me is the core issue here. If you think about a great collaboration in history, in any field, in music, Beatles is a good collaboration example. In science, the generation of quantum mechanics scientists are a good example. There's like these amazing examples, but each of the people involved was really fully formed, and the collaborations didn't last forever because they couldn't, and there wasn't anything automatic about them. They were hard. They involved risks and conflict, and the people became more individual in the course of them. And I think collaboration has to really be something. You have to be somebody before you can show yourself, and to pretend otherwise, you just lessen yourself. And that's been the big mistake of the recent years. And it's all because this stupid Google thing makes so much damn money. It does, and that's the problem. So everybody wants that.
There are questions in the higher altitudes.
Higher altitudes.
What can we learn from non-digital previous cultural lock-in and paradigms that we have rectified that may be applied to maybe some of the concerns that you have?
Well, I'll tell you. There are some interesting ones. I compared the Wikipedia to a traditional holy book without mentioning Torah specifically. But one of the things that really, if you read Torah scholarship where people derive the original individual voices and you can sort of start to hypothesize about people who wrote different parts of it, that to me is similar to the skill it takes to actually get something out of the Wikipedia instead of just being duped by a sort of a phony version of whatever the topic is. And you have to learn to find voice in an environment in which it's been suppressed. Now, so what happened with not just Torah, but with all of the holy books of the world is that exactly the same process was applied, where you have a bunch of people contribute, but then you forget who they are and you pretend it's divine. And then you're screwed. Then you end up in this world where everything's closed. And so the thing is, we were never the people of the book. We're always the people of the books, or at least those of us who are making a living for the community and not just living on the, well, I'm a little upset about some events in Jerusalem from today. And if you really believe there's only one book, as was so famously said in an American context, if you believe there's only one book, then that book loses value. But the idea, did anybody know who Aaron Marcus is? Oh, Aaron Marcus is a key figure in the history of computer information design. He lives in Berkeley. He's local. And Aaron did these wonderful talks in the 80s about, see, we were all thinking about what this stuff would be like, and he was using Talmud as the model of what the internet should be. Because so Ted Nelson, who I endorse in the book as being the person who really had a good idea about how to make all this stuff happen, had this one notion, and Aaron was saying, well, actually, there's this historical model that's kind of more sophisticated, and look at the Talmud, where you have commentary and commentary and commentary, but it's all distinct, so you can see different streams, and it's not all mushed. It's anonymous in a sense, because it's centuries old. We don't necessarily have the individual's name, but we definitely have a stream of the context in which each perspective came from. So it's not just all mushed into some sort of ideal perfect text where everything is equal and there's no context, but the global context. Talmud has multiple voices preserving context, which the Wikipedia and Torah taken by itself rejects. So Torah plus Talmud creates this optimistic Jewish culture, which continues through Spinoza and Einstein and Freud and all of us nutcases.
You mentioned that you have some problem with Apple, and it would be interesting to hear.
They just banned Ulysses. I mean, come on. I mean, it's like. I mean, come on. I can't. Who would have thought? I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Please finish your question.
That is the question.
That's the question. Okay, look, I have. There's a religious origin to Apple's problems, in my estimation. I'm going to get. Oh God. I always keep on wondering, like, when will I say the thing that finally gets me banished from Silicon Valley? So, here comes a candidate. I've never said this in public before. So I have a friend who was the first employee at Apple, though he never was compensated for that, and it was kind of an injustice. But at any rate, when he was young, he and Jobs were best friends, and they went to India to visit gurus and find enlightenment, and they did the whole hippie in India thing. And my friend came back saying, these gurus, shmurus, whatever. But Jobs came back saying, I want that job. And it's like, I think he's modeled the whole thing on the guru scam. So you treat your disciples kind of badly, you tell them what to do, you regiment them into these groups, and it's like a perfect modern revival of this ancient Indian craft. And so that's essentially what I think is happening there. But all right, but then to say something sympathetic about Apple, the thing about it is that if there's a contest right now perceived by many people between the sort of Linux, open everything, EFF, this whole ideology where you share stuff and mince it and mash it, and their authorship doesn't matter so much because you lose it in this grand collaboration that's supposed to somehow do something. So there's that versus the Apple thing, which is this super closed, we'll ban Ulysses to protect you from anyway, so this super open and super closed thing. The thing is, neither of those can win. They need each other. We either have the only question in the future is whether we have extremes or moderation. But if you're telling people that the only way to make money from content is to have one of those iPads, sorry to pick on you so much. You seem like a very nice man. I'm sorry, but But to have like some closed thing, if the only way to make money from content is to have the super closed thing, then you're going to have the super closed thing and some obsessive, abusive guru type running it. And the way out of this is not to try to have either the super open people or the super closed people win, but to have a middle path, moderation, which is what Ted Nelson's design would have given us. That's the only choice we have. There's no way that one of those will win. They create each other. So the insanity of Apple is in part created by the insanity of the open movement.
As opposed to the sanity of Ted Nelson?
Is Ted here? Okay. So Ted, as opposed to the sane layer within Ted. Is that good? Yeah. No, Ted, it's true. Ted as a model of sanity shows you how far this world has fallen. Oh, here, this poor fellow. Here, let me.
We're talking about Facebook and Twitter, what's my thought? There's 500 million people on Twitter, and for once, on Facebook, we're listening to the voices of millions of people, and these are ordinary people. These aren't the geniuses that are doing, the great collaborations and rocket science and things like that. This is the normal voice of small people. Now, people used to write letters, and almost all of that is gone. Letters get destroyed, even postcards. We can't track what people used to be like. Mm-hmm. And now, for once, we can listen in to this sort of ordinary voice, the common people's voice. And it's fascinating to listen to. Well, my view on it is that I love that voice, the thing you're talking about, but it appeared in the 90s with the web. Mm-hmm. And what's happened with Twitter is unless you aggressively use Twitter to try to get at that voice, what you instead get is this load of crap. Twitter has become... Well, you're saying that that's what ordinary people do.
No. I'm saying it's what you get out of the mass. Because the problem with Twitter, see, to my mind, Twitter and some of these other designs is a sponge that absorbed from the open web, which has the quality you talked about, which I adore. I absolutely adore, and have lauded endlessly and continue to. And it soaks it up into this commercial context where it gets filtered and lessened. So I agree that there are interesting tweets out there and that there are a lot of anecdotes that are quite profound or charming and positive. But overall, if you look at a tweet, right, Twitter streams, let's be honest, what you see, what?
With Facebook,
yeah.
I'm sort of looking over the shoulder of my 3 daughters as they go through their lives, and they're letting me know what clubs they're going to and who the people that they're seeing. I think it's sort of like the old days when you lived in a village. You would see Mrs. Smith. Oh, that's Mrs. Smith going to the post office, or the windows are open, and you see, oh, that's Mr. Jones, and he's doing, he's getting up or something like that. And you'd have this view. Yeah. They wouldn't tell you these things. You would just be noticing these things. So then when you would go and see them, and when you met them, you would know exactly what was going on in their lives.
Well, it's kind of like a village that is owned by the mine, and you can only shop in the company store or something. See, the thing is, I have this conversation a lot, where the qualities that you like in it, I absolutely acknowledge are there, but they were there in the open web in the first place. And what we have to understand here is that it's not these designs that bring you those qualities. Those were there. They might add a little bit of an organizing function on top in the same way that Craig Newmark did with Craigslist. There's like a little layer there that can help make things happen. I don't want to discount the importance of such a layer. But the fundamental openness and sharing and seeing into people's windows and seeing all that stuff was there before. What's happening is actually reducing it. The thing is that a lot of people only first encountered it in this commercial form, and so don't realize that there was something even better before. And so I end up in this position where I have to say, well, you don't know what you're missing frequently. And it's the last thing I want to do is tell you that there's anything invalid with the positive experience you're having. Go for it. I'd like to ask you to push yourself to see if there's more. I think I can do that.
Yeah, Yaron, you've alluded several times to 10 years ago as being some kind of a halcyon period where things were right and that have since gone terribly wrong, I guess, with the mass capitalization and Googleization and, of the web. Could you talk a little bit more about the virtues you see in the web 10 years ago, which was actually the height of the dot-com era, and there was all the burn rates and venture capital that was fueling tons of companies that were self-destructing.
Sure.
And tell me what the good things are that you're thinking about.
It's a reasonable question, and there's always a danger in thinking about better days in the past because they often really weren't, and I appreciate that. I'll give some specific examples. So there were two prototype social software projects. They were both Bay Area based because we make up all this stuff for everybody else. One was The Well and the other was Community Memory. And to me, does everybody know what I'm talking about? Okay, so we need a local history class sometime because it's amazing how much has come out of this funny little place we live. So Community Memory was this thing where there were little booths put up around Berkeley where you could get online, and there was something like a very early crude cross between Craigslist and Facebook or something like that. And it was this really idealistic thing that all these people believed in, and it degraded pretty quickly into something that really wasn't interesting anymore. A lot of, I'll leave it at that. I can talk more about it if anybody's interested, but it lost interest pretty quickly. The Well was a different model where people wrote. It wasn't database driven. It wasn't like little snippets, but they wrote substantial multi-paragraph messages to each other, and there was persistence. One of the key ideas from none other than Stuart Brand was you own your own words. We don't. How about that? So people, and the thing persists to this day, and it's still substantial, and it's still interesting, and people have been on it for decades. And a really interesting study would be to see what participation on the Well has done to people's net worth in their careers versus participation on Facebook or other designs. My hypothesis would be that people on the Well have done better per year of participating in it than people who've spent time on the diminishing designs that fragment what they do, in which they don't own their words. But that's a hypothesis. It's falsifiable. It's science, so somebody could do it. And anyway, so this is just to say that everything wasn't perfect, but there were ideas in play and in practice that I think were better. And there was still a kind of a humanism in a lot of design thinking that's very hard to come by these days, with the Well being an example.
I think what I'd like to suggest is that there are still a number of hands. We need to end pretty soon. Let's have 4 more quick questions, and Jaron, maybe you could do a kind of an omnibus answer / synthesis.
I'll wikify your questions. Okay.
Let's do a couple blitzkrieg questions, and then we'll, because I want to just.
Sure.
So from the Well, I knew Mitch Kapor and Terry Winograd, and they had a humanistic design initiative at Stanford that kind of didn't go anywhere. And I'm looking for, as a designer, ways to design in a manner that basically takes community to the next level, that we can have a more humanistic internet. One of the things I didn't get from your book is kind of these design points.
Can you bookmark that for a moment in your brain?
I got it.
Actually, I think my question really fits with that too. I'm wondering, the book is a manifesto, and I'm wondering I work with technology firms. They're such echo chambers, right? Like they're following that dominant paradigm, and the people that they're attracting do the same. What are some opportunities you see where people can influence the direction that things are going, like either in big steps or incrementally?
This might be harder than I thought.
Hi, Jaron. My comment or my question is that it seems to me that the internet will only be as humanist or as interesting as the individuals who use and who make it. So who or what is incubating these humanist individuals, these whole people? It seems children are so submerged in digital technology that there seems oftentimes to be a closed circuit of personality development. From where will come the raw material of life that makes us into whole people, the sort of people who will make technology humanistic?
All right, should we do one more and see what happens?
So you keep talking about how with Twitter and Facebook you get everything's closed in, but also it's the best news source that's totally decentralized, the dominant media. And if you could just talk to that a little bit about how that's completely shaken things up rather than being closed.
Okay, sure.
And cogging.
All right. So there's one. One question is another sort of defend your position, and the other three are fix this, please. So for defend my position, the thing is, I want to repeat something I said just now, which is that the stuff that you're talking about of opening things up and having an alternative to the official network news or something happened before all this stuff that I don't like. It was there. I mean, it was extraordinary in the 90s. But there was naturally there's less. The machines were still more expensive. I mean, there's a growth curve. So what happened is this other stuff leached onto it as it was taking off. I think that for every design that people praise, there are previous ones that are demonstrably better, that had a shot, that were squeezed off due to commercial interests. So ThinkQuest is better than Wikipedia, for instance. I think unquestionably, it helps answer your question, where ThinkQuest was really building whole minds and whole perspectives and was serving. It provided the benefits of Wikipedia, but much more so, both for the people who created it and for the people who used it. And so the thing is, it's not as if I'm saying, oh, these things are horrible and there's no alternative. What I'm saying is there actually were better alternatives. And so I view your position as compromised, as sort of like Panglossian or something. There's really better stuff that's been and that could be. It's not a choice between Twitter and TV, or if it is, man, what a shame that would be. And then on how to fix it. Well, there are a lot of good designs out there that deserve reconsideration, and I try to highlight, rather than providing entirely new inventions that are out of the blue in a little book, I try to highlight historical ones that I think are demonstrably better. Ted Nelson's Xanadu, implemented by non-insane people, would be better. ThinkQuest is better than Wikipedia. Well is better than Facebook. So it's not a matter of, it's not a battle of abstractions, but of actualities and demonstrated ones, real things. So I think the trick we're in here is not a sparse design space or a huge design mystery, but rather a business lock, or it's a power struggle. It's not a problem of imagination, but a problem of struggle, and it's a really interesting one. That's just the nature of our times, and it's very strange that nerds instead of wars decide who makes it in this century. It used to be wars and oil, and now it's like nerds. It's so strange. I sometimes think that the whole world is a revenge of high school sexual politics or something, on many levels. That's probably the smartest thing I can tell you tonight. And with that, I bid you good night.